So tonight I'm going to talk about seasonal prep of your summer veggies for your summer veggie beds. And a lot of the background of this is what we do at our garden every week. And just to clarify, our garden, when I say our garden, I don't mean my home garden. I mean the Master Gardener demonstration garden off Ignacio Valley on Shadelands. And so a lot of what I talk about here is what we've been doing there for several years with great success, and hopefully it works for you as well. This talk is going to really kind of stay grounded. We're just going to talk about the soil. And so I'm going to talk about it in terms of pre-season, prepping your beds now. Those of you that shopped at our great tomato plant sale the last couple of weeks, you're probably raring to get those things planted and in the ground. And then I'm going to talk about in-season work you can do to help to protect and to maintain your beds. And then wrap up with kind of a post-season of what to do when the summer crops are done. And so what I'm not going to talk about is I'm not going to go in depth on fertilizers and amendments. We've got terrific detailed talks on these categories, fertilizer and amendments. We've got a great irrigation talk coming up by Lori Palmquist, June 21st. And not going to go deeply into planning or planting your beds. And actually tomorrow at our garden, we do weekly talks, and there are fertilizers and amendments talks there tomorrow at 10 a.m. So jumping into this topic, I want to start with a little historical context. So over the Christmas holidays, I found a couple of great books on soil fertility. And the first one, Farmers of 40 Centuries, was written in 1911. The other one, An Agricultural Testament, was written in 1940. And it's talking all about soil fertility at those times. Now, I kind of know where your head went on that. It's like, this is what he does over Christmas vacation. Yes, well, yes, it kind of is. But back to the topic at hand. The lessons from those books are that the author of the Farmers of 40 Centuries could see the Dust Bowl coming to the US based on what he was seeing at farms throughout the East in the early 1900s. Soils were getting depleted. Farmers were just moving on to new land rather than trying to replenish it. And he was looking for other solutions. How did these farmers do that? In particular, in Japan, Korea, and China, where they had these small family farms that would stay in the family for generations, and they were able to maintain soil fertility. And then the other one, the author was a British ambassador to India for agriculture. And he saw what happened in the US. Again, this was written in 1940. And he saw what happened in the US. And he didn't want that to happen in Great Britain. What could he learn from what they were doing in India? And what was common to both books was the soil fertility was aggressively repaired with each cropping year, and by adding organic matter from all kinds of different sources. And so in the 40 Centuries books, they were cutting clover from hillsides and bringing it down and tucking it into rice paddies. They were dredging canals, flipping the silt up onto the banks, letting it dry, and then spreading it on fields. And they were adding urban and rural manures in compost piles and letting that compost and then spreading that on fields. Absolutely nothing went to waste. All the scraps that were left over from vegetable matter to animal matter was recycled into the soil. And the same thing with the Ag Testament book. In India, they were doing, particularly in indoor, they were doing these very large compost piles, and they started with pits. And so they would start with digging a pits, and the reason they do a pit is it would maintain soil temperature evenly, and it wouldn't get as hot and cold as it would as if it was above ground. But it was the same type of thing in that they were recycling vegetable waste, animal residues, and crop residues. And in all these methods, the benefit was they had longevity of production without having to rely on additional fertilizers. So now we fast forward 100 years. This is a document that's published by the USDA called Farming in the 21st Century. I know the type is too small to read there, so I'll go over kind of the bullet points of it. At the end of the talk, when you complete the survey, I have a resource page there, and a link to this page to this pamphlet is on there. So we come forward 100 years, and the conversation is still happening in the US about how can we repair depleted soils? How can we keep our soil fertile? And from this pamphlet, we take away 4 key points. You manage the soil by disturbing the soil less, meaning not tilling. You diversify the soil by crop diversity, by planting many different plants in there as it occurs in nature, not just monocropping. And then you keep the soil covered as much as possible. Some speakers will call it armoring the soil, protecting it from the elements. And then finally, growing living roots throughout the year in the soil. There's kind of a myth out there that that the soil needs to rest after you grow a crop in it. It does not need to rest. It needs to stay active and engaged. And by having plants in the ground all the time, that allows it to do that. So this is a pretty strong quote that comes from that pamphlet. Tilling the soil is the equivalent of an earthquake, hurricane, tornado, and forest fire occurring simultaneously to the world of soil organisms. Simply stated, tillage is bad for the soil. So pretty strong statement, but we still see tillage going on everywhere. You drive down Highway 5, you drive down out Highway 80 towards Sacramento, you still see it everywhere. So this brings it around to, okay, so what does this mean to me? I just want to grow some tomatoes. I'm not a farmer. Well, what it can mean to you is less work if you're not having to dig everything up, less soil, less expense, fewer inputs to the soil. You'll end up using less water, which is very important these days. And in the end, you end up with healthier soil that needs fewer inputs still. So this is something that we show in many of our talks. Exactly what is soil? I think it tends to surprise a lot of people. Typical soils made up of 45% minerals, which is going to be like silt, sand, clay. 5% organic matter, 25% air, and 25% water. So fully half of the soil is really just the passage of air and water through channels in the ground. So the less you disturb that, the better off the soil is going to be. And so here I show the tale of 2 soils. On the left is a scoop of soil from our ground at our garden. And you can see it looks dramatically different from the plowed field on the right. This was off Highway 80 near Dixon on the right. And so you can see it's very dark and rich looking. Some speakers will describe it as moist chocolate cake, but it's aggregated. It all holds together. It's alive. You can see the one earthworm that didn't duck in for the picture taking. There were several others that got away. And it holds together, and it's very rich. The soil on the right is very crumbly, sandy, tan, not a lot of organic matter in there. It's very different. And what we want to seek is the soil on the left. And so these are the steps we go through at our garden in prepping beds for each season. And this process is starting actually there tomorrow as we start our first planting of the season. And so what we'll do is we'll clear off whatever's planted on that bed currently, whether that could be weeds, that could be cover crop, that could be some winter crop that's still left there. And the way we do this is we simply cut those plants off at the ground level. We don't pull them out. We want to leave those roots in the ground, allow them to decompose in place there, and feed that soil. And then what we do next depends on how quickly we want to flip that bed. If we have a couple of weeks before we're going to plant, we will probably choose to compost in place. We're going to put that green matter chopped up small right back down on the bed. If we want to flip that bed today and go right on to planting it after prepping it, we'll move all those greens to our compost area where they'll be shredded and composted there. But so the choice between the two is really just a function of time. If we've got a couple of weeks, we'll compost in place. And the steps involved with that is chopping those greens up small, as we've done there on the left. We add a layer of compost over the top of that, and then we cover that with burlap. It doesn't necessarily have to be burlap. That's what we use because it's relatively tidy and easy to do. But what we want to do is cover all that green matter and compost, keep the light out so the plants don't continue to grow for any stalks that may be sticking out. Also to keep the moisture and the heat in so that it decomposes more rapidly. And so we'll leave it like that for a good couple of weeks with the burlap bags over it. And that's the way we compost in place. After that's done, we would be ready to do the additional prep. Our next step, if necessary, is to aerate the soil. And we don't do this at our garden anymore. We haven't in several years just because the soil, water percolates right through it, so we don't need to. But you really just need to make the judgment call on how water infiltrates into your soil. And so even if we cut the plants and remove them, or we compost it in place and we're ready for the next step is to check the aeration. And so you can dig a small hole there and fill it with water and see how that water percolates in. If it drains right down, you really don't need to do anything else to it. If the water stands there, then I would suggest aerating it. The tool on the left is a broad fork, and not everyone's going to buy one of these. They're great in a large garden, but for the home gardener, it's probably overkill. But it's just a much larger version of the garden fork that's on the right. And so what you do is you step on that crossbar, dig the tines into the soil, pull those red arms back towards you, and it slices through the soil. You're not turning the soil, you're just slicing the soil. And so you're trying to disturb it less. Nowhere have I mentioned we want to turn the soil. We don't do double digging anymore. For those not familiar with that, that's where you dig out a trench, take out that soil, mix it with some kind of amendment and put it back in. In doing that, you've kind of disturbed all the organisms and all the water capillaries and channels that were in there when you do that. We don't do that anymore. And we don't even turn it over. We'll just aerate it if it needs it, and that's it. And so the other thing that does is it'll over time, it'll reduce your weed pressure. If you've got a lot of weeds in your vegetable bed each year, stop turning the soil, and those dormant seeds will stay underground out of light, and that's what you want. And so we can do it with a broad fork on the left, or aerate it with the home fork on the right, a very useful tool to have. And then at that point, we're ready to move on to the next step. But first, a reminder, you heard no mention of a rototiller. Rototilling is just like tilling on a large scale farm. What happens is with those blades, you chop up everything that's underground, whether it's the organisms or the structure or the water channels that may be there. What you're doing is you're actually starting over each year. And so whatever structure developed with the plants in the ground last year really kind of get destroyed when you rototill the next year. So I get that sometimes you have to rototill the first season or two on a new bed. But after that, I'd put it away. You probably won't need it. When we first opened up our garden 10 years ago, the soil there was so hard that the rototillers bounced off the soil. They wouldn't even penetrate the soil. And when we put in the fruit trees in the orchard, they had to bring in an auger to drill the holes in the ground to be able to get the trees potted. But that's a pretty extreme case. And so after a season or two, you're able to put away the rototiller. The other thing that can happen with the rototiller is if you're rototilling the same spot year after year, you can develop your own hard pan at the bottom of that, and it makes it difficult for roots to penetrate down through that. So because you're skimming off the same depth each time. So let's set aside the rototiller if we can. So our next step is amending the soil. And you'll hear us advocate, whether it's at an Ask a Master Gardener table or at the garden or in talks like this, we always advocate starting with a soil test. You wouldn't just start buying medicines without seeing a doctor, and doing a bunch of additives to your soil is kind of the same thing. Adding a bunch of stuff that you may not necessarily even need. And so we do a soil test at our garden about every 3 years, just to see how things are. And what that's going to tell you is, excuse me, what that's going to tell you is what's present in the soil as far as key nutrients. I'm fighting a nagging cough, and hopefully it doesn't nag too much. So it's going to tell you the key nutrients that are in the soil. It'll tell you what's low or missing. It'll tell you the pH. And it's going to tell you the amount of organic matter you've got in there, which is always very important. And then the other thing that's helpful is it's going to tell you what you might supplement it with. So what corrections could be made and what would be helpful. And so while we don't advocate any particular brands or companies, we do have a list of several companies, several labs available through our help desk. I've included a link to that in that resource page at the end as well, for a number of the labs that Master Gardeners have tried, without endorsing anyone in particular. So still is very useful, certainly at least once in a new garden. So at that point, we're ready to amend the soil. And just to define our terms here, an amendment is a physical addition to the soil. So whether that's compost or manures or chicken poop or bat guano or whatever, those are amendments to the soil. Fertilizers, on the other hand, are an additive to feed the plants. It's not something that builds the soil. So at our garden, we use a lot of compost. We dress it, which you'll see in a minute. We dress every bed with compost when we're done. We don't use a lot of manures. Manures, horse manure, cow manure, chicken manure we'll use once in a while. But horse and cow manure can be very tricky. You have to really be sure of the source you're getting it from to make sure there's no herbicides in there. We were blending it into our compost that we make at our garden a couple of years ago, and we had a little trouble with it in one of the beds. At least that's as what we diagnosed. We had one bed that all the tomato plants were just stunted when everything else around it was growing terrifically. And we ended up digging down in the soil to see if we could find anything that's going on. And we found some very anaerobic clumps of horse manure in there. Very strong smelling. And we kind of dug that out and blended in a whole bunch of compost, and that solved the problem. And this was a source that we'd gotten horse manure from for years. So we're pretty tentative in using manures that we're not sure of the source on. I will use steer manure to top dress my lawns in the fall. It's a good, cheap way to do that. But I tend to shy away from it for edibles. And then as fertilizers go, we tend to stick to basic balanced organic fertilizers. They tread lightly, which is a good thing to do with fertilizers. And we follow the label directions really religiously. So in this picture, you can see we do it one of two ways. On the right, we will broadcast fertilize the whole bed. And so this, for a 100 square foot bed, used about 9 cups. That's the directions on the back of the package. And it looks like it's just barely dusted, but we stick with what the directions are. For some of our real heavy feeders, we'll follow the package directions that discuss how to feed it right into the potting hole. And it's usually a teaspoon or a tablespoon, depending on the size of the pot that's going in there. And you stir it up at the bottom so it won't burn the roots. And that's really about all we do with that. We tread pretty lightly on it. And just to do kind of a refresher, if you don't know, on the numbers that are on the fertilizer packages, the numbers stand for the percentage in the package of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so kind of an easy way to think of what each of those do is nitrogen grows the plant up, phosphorus grows the plant down, developing roots. Potassium tends to grow the plant around, so as far as developing flowers and developing fruit and that type of thing. And so you can see in a starter fertilizer, nitrogen is going to be a little less impressive or important than phosphorus, than developing roots. We don't necessarily want to start stimulating plant growth before we've got great roots in the ground. And we certainly don't care about developing flowers or fruit yet. A lot of people will use a balanced fertilizer, just a straight 5-5-5. And then just for contrast, I show what a bloom fertilizer will do. So very high concentrations of phosphorus and potassium to stimulate bloom growth. I'll use this with my roses or in potted ornamentals to get one more blast of color out of them. I've done it with the roses, like before having a garden party, where we sit around and talk about compost. But those higher percentage will give you a great flush of blooms, but not for everyday use. And again, can't stress enough, don't overdo it. This is an example of a citrus tree in a pot that was, over fertilized 1 week, and boom, it's gone. So if anything, tread a little lightly on the fertilizer. So our next step is going to be top dressing the bed. And so what we do is our beds are 100 square feet. So what we do is we'll add 2 to 3 wheelbarrow loads of compost over the top of that amended soil, that soil that's gotten the fertilizer. And we just rake it smooth. I know some people like to rake it in. Again, we're trying to disturb the soil as little as possible. And so we just smooth it out and really kind of let nature take its course, let the earthworms come and get it. So, and it seems to work out really well. And so when we're rolling, we'll be able to, flip beds in 30 or 40 minutes. So at that point, we're ready to plant. And so you can see in the picture there, we've got the water lines down. At our garden, we use drip irrigation. It really is the most efficient way to go. It puts the water right on the soil. And so I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of irrigation here. Again, Lori's got a great talk coming up in June, and she has one from last year that's on YouTube still, I believe. But just some key points to focus on when planting and when watering. You want to start with moist soil, and that includes the plant that's going in the ground. Make sure that's well watered, and make sure the ground is well watered. At home, I'll usually dig the hole, fill it with water, let it drain, and then the plant goes in. And that's because you don't want either area to be dry and to be wicking water back and forth to try and reach some kind of equilibrium. So we want it to be balanced and right from the start. We want to be watering the soil, not the plants. So this is the great thing about using drip, is it waters all the soil. And the reason you do that is you want the roots to spread as far as they can. One of our other master gardeners when he'd do a library talk, he would project a full-size tomato root system up on the wall and show the roots 6 feet deep and going out 2 or 3 feet wide. And then he'd put a little emitter in the middle of it, and he'd say, how can this little emitter from a sprinkler system possibly water all of those roots? It really can't. You've got to water the whole soil to be able to do that. And so you can do that with drip, and you can do that in all 3 methods, but the most efficient one is drip. And then finally, you don't want to set it and forget it. When I work at Ask a Master Gardener table sometimes, and people may be having trouble with some particular plants, and will always ask, so how do you water it? And oftentimes you'll get a response that it is, oh, it's all set, it's all timered. Okay, that's great, but you don't know what the plants are getting unless you actually go check it. You really got to go look at it, and I'll go through that in a moment. But so as far as irrigation methods, drip is the most efficient. Sprinklers are probably the most inefficient. We've all seen lawn sprinklers, pouring into the rain gutters, in our neighborhoods, or just not going where they're supposed to go. And one of the difficulties with using sprinklers or pop-up heads in veggie beds and raised beds is once those plants mature, they're going to block the spray, and it's not going to water evenly because of the zucchini leaves or the tomato stems or whatever. So sprinklers just don't work as well in a bed as drip does. But and actually a solid fallback is to water by hand. Again, you don't want to be overwatering by hand, but at our garden, when we plant new plants, we water by hand every day for the first 2 weeks, just to make sure that plant's well established. And while not everyone's got the time to do that in their garden, and that's why they use timers, the thing it forces you to do is really take a good look at what's going on. You're standing there and you're seeing how the plant is doing. You're able to dig in and see how wet or dry the soil is, versus, you know, setting a timer at 5 a.m. and never really seeing what happens. So there are certain benefits to watering by hand. So how do you check the moisture? So we've got a couple different methods here. The first one's a moisture meter. And basically the way they work is they measure the conductivity of the soil. So the wetter the soil, the better it conducts electricity. So that's how a moisture meter works. And it'll give you a reading of dried, moist, or wet. And you can calibrate them to fine tune that so you know exactly when it says it's moist, what that actually means in your soil. But you're sticking a probe into the ground, and you're really not getting to know what's going on underground. And so we tend not to use those. You can dig down by hand, which is a great way to check the moisture. So take a trowel, dig down 6 inches and see what the soil looks like. And so if you can squeeze that soil into a ball and have it hold together, you've got adequate moisture there. If you can squeeze water out of it, it's going to be too wet. But and if it's really wet and sticky, that's going to be too much moisture. But you'll certainly be able to tell if it's dry, if it won't hold together. What we use at our garden is the soil probe. And what you're doing with that is taking a core sample out of the bed. You use that T-handle and kind of drill it down into the soil and pull up a core sample. These retail for about $20 online, and some nurseries carry them as well. This is the one that I have at home. It's about 1 foot long. The one we use at the garden is 18 inches. It's a bigger one, but this is sufficient to get a good idea of what's going on. And so by actually taking out a core sample, you get a good indication of what's going on underground. So you pull that core sample out and say it's dry on the top couple inches and then moist down below. That's telling you probably about ready to water again. Or maybe you're giving adequate water, just not quite frequently enough, that allows the top to dry out. And there's so much root activity in the top couple inches of soil. But the other side of that is if it's quite moist on the top couple inches and then it's dry and crumbly below that, you may be watering frequently, but you're not watering deeply enough. And so what it tells you, you've got to probably water less frequently and more deeply to get all the way down through the root zone of those deep-rooted plants. If you've got even moisture through the whole core sample, that's ideal. But that's something that the soil probe enables you to check. And we check the soil at random beds at our garden every week. Okay, so our next point is to diversify with crop diversity. And so the only time you really see monocrops like the one on the left is done by the hand of man, right? Whether it's corn or orchards or, single product farms, that's really, you only see that. In nature, you'll see a broad diversity of plants in the ground. And the benefit of that is it attracts a wide variety of beneficial insects and organisms, and a varying amount of microorganisms under the soil, because different organisms are attracted to different plants. And so the bed on the right is our family bed at our garden. And what we do there is we've got 100 square feet and we pretend it's someone's house. And so we try and plant as much as we can, as diverse as we can, and we produce hundreds of pounds out of there. So in this bed, you can see some red lettuce there. There's garlic in there. There's some Swiss chard. Not sure what that is on the right. I think those were turnips. And then we also, we got tomatoes out of there. We did corn this year, cucumbers, sweet potatoes, a wide variety of different things, peas and beans, all out of this 100 square foot space, producing several hundred pounds. I think it was 400 or 500 pounds. So it shows what's possible. And that diversity helps bring the soil along through that whole thing. Just to give you an idea of some of the rooting varieties that different plants have. Obviously, there's some big guys there on the right, the tomatoes going down 4 feet, and asparagus and artichokes have huge root systems. But we never put in just one thing. Even in our tomato beds, where we'll plant 8 tomatoes in that 100 square foot space, we're always going to interplant with different things to get variety in the soil. So we'll plant a bunch of different herbs, whether it's basil or parsley or thyme or cilantro, and then whenever else we can add something else in, we look to do that. We also do pollinators in there. We also have sunflowers continue to come back each year, and we have tomatillos that kind of pop up everywhere of their own will. So we haven't planted tomatillos in 2 years, and we got grocery bags of tomatillos going to Monument Crisis Center. So a wide variety will improve the diversity of your crops and also improve your soil. This is an old picture that it's prairie grasslands. Perhaps you've seen it online before, but I think it's a great showing of what different roots can be on the ground. Those little squigglies over there on the left edge, that's what turf grass is. That's what lawn looks like. Goes down less than a foot and then comes up a few inches. So our next important factor is keeping the soil covered or armored. And this is actually kind of where this talk started. We were doing an irrigation talk last year, and the subject came up about mulch. And all of a sudden, the mulch hit the fan. We got 80 questions about mulch in about 2 minutes. And so that was kind of the genesis for this talk. But what mulch enables you to do is reduce the weeds, reduce the watering, because it's going to keep moisture in. It helps moderate the temperature so you don't get the big swings. It's really a huge benefit to add mulch to the soil. And there's all kinds of different mulches out there. So there's a link on the handout, the resource handout, that is a paper done by UCA&R, and it talks about minuses of a whole bunch of different amendments, specifically mulches. Here we've got three that are pretty common. The first one is straw, which is what we use at our garden on the left. The one is what I use at home. I use crumbled leaves because I get a ton of leaves every year. And so when they dry, I crumble them up and add about 1 inch of those over the top of my beds. And the one on the right is a nice tidy way to use wood chips. And so the wood chips, they're only about 1 inch or so deep. And they present a nice tidy bed while doing the same thing the others do. They're kind of difficult when the season's over to rake them all off. You want to rake them all off. You don't turn them into the soil because they will suck nitrogen out of the soil as they break down if they're underground. But wood chips is another option. And so here's an example of moderating the soil temperature. So this was at our garden last summer. It was an 85-degree day, and I kind of went around the garden with an infrared thermometer, taking different readings. And so there was a patch of dry ground there, and the temperature read 132 degrees on an 85-degree day. Soil was hot, it was dry, and even on the mulch surface on another bed, it was 126 degrees. in that same spot, I brush the mulch aside, and the soil temperature is 75 degrees and the soil is moist underneath, where you see the soil on the left is dry. That's the difference the mulch can make, and certainly enable you to water less, like it enables us to. The other thing, it protects its soil from the other elements as well. So whether that's wind or, God willing, rain, because rain can really actually beat up the soil, and a heavy rain can wash away topsoil and cause erosion. Where having a mulch on top of that, it allows it to trickle in gently. So yeah, but what do we do now in the postseason? Well, you can kind of do the same things. You can continue to grow stuff, whether it's a cover crop or something to eat. So for instance, on the right, I had pulled a tomato plant out of this wine barrel and planted a broccoli in there in the fall, and had that in there along with some other greens. I had some thyme in there and some lettuces and cilantro, to keep that soil active and to continue to be productive. You can put in a cover crop, which is great for feeding the soil. We use a mix of 8 to 10 different seeds in there to get as much diversity as possible. You can also feed the soil by chopping up and composting in place, like we showed at the beginning. So this was a tomato plant that, and let me emphasize, a healthy tomato plant. You don't want to do this with a sick plant, with a plant that's diseased at all. You can tell on a tomato how healthy it is by certainly any damage on the leaves, and cutting the stem in half and seeing if it's dark inside to see if it's got any kind of wilt. If that's the case, an unhealthy plant, you want to pull the whole thing out, roots and all, in your trash bin, not in your green bin. But if it's a healthy plant, chop it up, cover it with compost, just like we did in our bed prep at the beginning, and let that soil continue to be fed. But all three of those will keep your soil active going into the winter. So just to kind of summarize, in the preseason, we want to build the soil while disturbing it as little as possible. The result of this is less work for you and less expense, not a bunch of additives necessary to be added in there, and not a bunch of tools necessary to even do it. And then in season, we want to protect the soil from the elements while providing a diverse variety of plants the moisture that they need. So provide less water, and protect the soil that way. And then in the postseason, keep roots in the ground if you can, and keep the soil active and alive. It'll mean less expense down the road, fewer weeds, and healthier soil.